We're here today for a special session of Conceptual Foundations. Due to the weather, the scarcity of classes in this building, and the busy schedule of our professors, we have had to go virtual and are coming to you as a special video presentation, the first ever in Conceptual Foundations history. Our topic today is the rise of China, and we're joined by Professor Andrew Nathan of Columbia and Professor Xiaobo Liu of Barnard, two recognized experts. Given the shortness of our period today, I'm not going to elaborate on their many distinguished accomplishments, only to say that they both have a lot to contribute to this discussion. Xiaobo, Andy, thank you for joining us. The role of the U.S. in the world has been perhaps the most discussed topic of the past 20 years in international relations, but I think it's likely that the most discussed topic of the next 20 years will be the rise of China. And I would like to begin our discussion from the inside out, looking at domestic politics and then turning to foreign policy. We will do about 40 minutes of discussion amongst ourselves and then turn to the students from Conceptual Foundations who joined us today. The largest, most important question about domestic politics is, of course, the stability and evolution of the current system. And the current leadership transition raises questions about this, since it seemed to involve considerable disagreement, although perhaps you can help us understand about what. Is the leadership divided over the economy and the social contract, over corruption, over the role of civil society, over the future course of China in some way that we can help us understand what the rise of China is going to be like? How do you see the impact of this disagreement on a favorite phrase of yours, Andy, authoritarian resilience? Does it show authoritarian resilience, or does it show that instead China is perhaps moving in some halting way toward a more open system? One of the readings assigned this week claims that China is going to inevitably democratize. So what does the current leadership transition help us understand about China's direction?
There's been a tremendous sense of expectation of instability surrounding this leadership transition. There's a pervasive feeling in China that things have to change in a fundamental way. And that feeling itself is a kind of meta-instability in the system. However, and it's grounded in the fact that they face tremendous problems: corruption, environmental problems, rapid social change. Nobody believes in, communism anymore, rise of religions and stuff like that. At the same time, though, to me, the lesson of the power transition is that the system, for the time being, still remains resilient in the sense that they did carry off the transition on time. They've produced a new leadership of competent, as far as we know, tested officials who rose up through the party. They seem not to have any real ideological disagreements like we have in the US between the left and the right. Even Bo Xilai, who bid for power on a kind of platform of being a leftist, I think didn't really believe in anything like that. He was just using it as a brand name to distinguish himself. So I don't see any, there are all kinds of, any leadership making decisions will have disagreements about a variety of decisions, but no hard ideology lines of battle, and the leadership seems to be able to stick together. So it looks like the leadership is stable for the time being, and that Xi Jinping is a relatively strong leader coming in with power relatively consolidated even at the beginning of his 10 years in office. And I don't see the regime splitting So the question would be, will society rise up and overthrow them maybe at some point in the future when some event triggers an uprising? That might be another way to look at it.
We'll turn to that after we hear from Xiaobo about this question. Authoritarian resilience confirmed by what we've seen lately?
Yes, to a large degree, I agree with Andy that the leadership transition does show that China's institutionalization in the last 30 years in terms of power succession, power transition, has been more or less smooth. I mean, there were bumps and along the road, and this time around, of course, there are a couple of unknown events that have thrown away the regional plan, if you will. That include Bo Xilai's corruption case, and also, as the New York Times reported yesterday, there was also the death of a close associate to Hu Jintao, whose position would have been stronger in terms of horse trading and negotiation behind the door about who would be in, who would be in the power circle and the most important circle, had that not been this incident. But overall, I agree with Andy. I think at the leadership level, the division was not quite ideological in the terms of a sort of a future vision of China. Rather, it is probably on how to get there, the speed of it, sequence of change. And I think there are a number of consensus among the leaders, whoever are in there, or whichever background they come from, factions or groupings where they come from. Number one, they both all realize that after 30 years of reform, there really has to be some sort of renewed social contract. We'll come to that point when we talk about society. And they also realize that corruption is a life-threatening, is a regime-threatening problem. And they all, I think, agree that they have to do something about it. And I see, if anything new, I see this round of power transition is that how fast they want to do something right after the leadership is in power, is in position. I think they would do something pretty dramatic maybe this time around, and already I see that has already started, meaning anti-corruption. So they know that this is something they have to deal with as a priority. And thirdly, I think there is a consensus that economy remains important, and there has to be a continuation of structural reform. Except of course there's probably some divisions on how the reform and which area and the speed of which maybe there's some debate about it. But overall, I agree that I think the leadership transition has been fine.
Can I ask you to expand on what you said about the need to renew the social contract?
Right.
How serious a problem is this? What's the nature of the social contract now, and what would it mean to renew it?
Right. I think.
And how much does it change the Chinese regime?
Sure. I think now that we're basically talking about more than 30 years of reform, and when it first started, I think Deng Xiaoping struck a kind of post-Mao social contract with the populace, and that is that during the Maoist time, politics was in command. Everything is about class struggle, about continuous revolution, is about politics. Deng said, no, that failed us. What we should do is to improve people's livelihood. So it's pocketbook stupid. So it's all about getting China to be a well-to-do society. And he specifically set the goal. And that excited people. That's a new kind of social contract for the people who came out of this chaos of a cultural revolution, Maoist era. And that had worked, meaning that people with that understanding that the Communist Party will lead them to a better life materially, and to improve their livelihood. And that, I think, at least for the first 20 years, that seems to be the kind of social contract with the party. But that contract seemingly getting, the efficacy of it getting diminished. And meaning that people now, you obviously China had a growing middle class in the urban area. Even migrant workers, the former farmers who used to be really the powerless and the poorest, now they're average income has been on the rise as well. Let alone there is also the rich. China has a increasingly large group of super rich and rich. I mean, so there are different people that benefited differently from the reforms and materially, and their livelihood has been improved. But the question I think I see that from Chinese society point is that's not enough anymore. We want more. They want different things. Participation, some say in affairs, in public affairs. So you can see that from many cases. Take, for example, now that mass movement or collective action on environmental issues. 20, 30 years ago, this is unheard of, unimaginable. The Chinese would take a collective action about an environmental issue that affects their life. Not just because somehow their self-interest, but also because they're considering something just beyond the money and income. So I think that is the kind, and corruption is another issue that, all right, so it worked in the last 30 years, may help some people get rich and so on, but then you also see people that more and more they get uncertain about the future. They're getting uncertain about the future. So what the next 30 years, you asked about next 20 years life for China, and that uncertainty, that kind of resentment about corruption, that kind of eagerness to have something new, more beyond money, that's what I think it has to be.
What do you think about this proposition that the rise of the middle class requires a renegotiation of the social contract? Is that the main source of pressure for change in China?
Yeah, I agree with Xiaobo. I think that people in China are sort of fed up with the lies and the sort of fakery of the regime and the sort of regime claiming that we're scientific socialism, scientific development. Without us, China can't survive. Everything should be a secret. We'll decide. People are sort of fed up with that. But I'm not sure, though, that it is the main. It is one of, but not necessarily the main. I'm not sure Xiaobo said it's the main motive for change, but because they face a lot of challenges. They need to build a social welfare system. They need to solve the environmental problem, not only because people want it, but because they have to solve it, objectively, because of the damage that it does to public health, the cost that it imposes, the water problem, a lot of problems that they need to solve, the fragility of the economy, which is, kind of unbalanced on the side of state investment driving growth and things like this. So I think they need to make a lot of changes, and part of it, a big part of it really is I would put it in another, same thing in another way, kind of re-upping their legitimacy or their acceptability to the public. But I think they'll only do it in a way that they believe will sustain single-party rule.
I want to get the two of you to talk a little bit about corruption, because this is frequently seen in societies that have attained the sort of middle income status as the grievance of the new middle class that wants more accountable government. It's an explosive problem because it tends to set a leadership against itself. Who is going to take the rap for corruption? Who's going to jail because his son is out in an accident with a Ferrari? Can you describe how you think this corruption problem plays out in leadership politics or in remaking the regime?
Well, before I do that, I want to say I think there are two kinds of corruption in China. One that helps the regime, which is sort of lubricating the relationship between the business community and the regime, and the other one that hurts it is the one that gets publicized and which outrages the public conscience, which is connected in their minds to officials abusing cultural values, like the son in the Ferrari, or the guy with the watches, or the guy with the girls, things that. So what they need to do is partly to get corruption somewhat under control, and partly to get control over the public presentation of corruption and hide some of it. But in the internal leadership politics, it is very much who's going to take the fall. Now, Bloomberg published an article some months ago telling about the riches of the whole Xi Jinping family. Xi Jinping is the new leader. Wen Jiabao was outed in the New York Times for the wealth of his family. What's the difference between the two? Well, one difference is Xi Jinping's in power. Wen Jiabao is going out of power. But how can you rationalize that difference? So the rationalization is the relatives is similar to the U.S. You know, the Bush family is very wealthy. Did any Bush, while in office, abuse the powers of that office? So the Xi family can claim that while we were in office, we didn't abuse. And the rule in the Chinese Communist Party is the wife, the children, the father and the mother, and the guy himself. Those are the ones that have to be clean. There's no rule that the cousins and the brothers and sisters and all the other people have to be clean. That's not the rule. So Xi Jinping can say, me, my wife, and my kid, and my parents are dead, we're clean. Wen Jiabao's wife has got money. His mother has money. You know, so this is the difference, very, very subtle difference, but the rules are, that's the rule.
Yeah.
How do you see this problem changing the regime?
This might be sort of, again, relate to my earlier sort of suggestion that there's this sort of old contract versus new contract. So part of the old contract, one could argue that it has this component of tolerance of certain degree of corruption. I mean, that is as sort of the second type of corruption, as Andy was pointing out, that the kind of corruption that the government uses, you know, if you call it crony capitalism. It existed in Indonesia, exists in Korea, exists, you know, elsewhere. You know, a lot of late developers utilize, you know, sort of the positive side of corruption that sometimes can coexist with development. And that, I think, is what China had, you know. And also people felt, you know, some people felt that, all right, so everybody does it. If I can do it, you know, you can benefit it, it's okay. So that is a widespread, but at least it's a competitive. So people see everybody has a chance. Now, then the second type, that is that hers regime legitimacy is the type that people feel, well, see, only leaders can do it. They're in those in the power position that can do it. And they become, that hurts legitimacy because people become cynical. What else we don't know? This is what's so dangerous to the regime's stability is that, all right, so even Xi or Li Keqiang now said to be very clean. No, you know, he has only one daughter and, you know, wife is a professor at university, so obviously he's all right. But then again, you know, tell that to the Chinese and now, wait a minute, we don't believe that. See, that would really has everybody's all in the same pot, and that really could damage the legitimacy. Now, I think again, this is it would relate to the question about, you know, the Ferraris, the expensive watches, and you know, and the accounts overseas and all that. I think one of the biggest resentment for people is that it's all behind the door, meaning there's nothing that's public and nobody knows who and gets what and that. So one of the key part of the anti-corruption effort, and I think the government realized it has to be this, you know, sort of so-called sunshine law. You gotta have everybody declare, even though there will be cynicism among people. Oh yeah, they all say they have that, but we don't believe. But still, that's a first important step, significant step, institutionally. That to, you know, at least have some sort of, you know, sort of a deterrence effect for those who are thinking engaged in it. Because you have to, if you wanted to get to a certain position, your book is you know, your private affair it's a fair game, so to speak. You have to open that, and that I think it's probably going to be, and that I think it will be this next 4 years. We're probably going to see that in China.
I want to pivot to foreign policy. You've both used the term legitimacy, and some people say that one alternative source of legitimacy with ideology no longer available, since you said, Andy, that nobody believes in communism, is nationalism. Can you talk about whether nationalism is supposed to play this role? And the related question is whether domestic pressure and public opinion become a source of pressure on foreign policy.
Yeah, I think, the regime has, in fact, achieved a lot of great things in its foreign policy. China has stood up. China's recognized as a great power. China's got the U.S. frightened. They're pushing Japan around. These are good things. And I think that the population takes a lot of satisfaction from it, and that this is a source of legitimacy for the regime. By the same token, it's a source of tremendous vulnerability if they make a misstep. So, for example, if they do wander into an armed clash with Japan and the U.S. assists Japan and the Chinese lose, that could be extremely dangerous for them, I think. But I think so far, the manifestations of nationalistic sentiment have been pretty much turned on and off by the regime, and it hasn't threatened them and hasn't, I think, pushed them into foreign policy actions that they didn't calculate that they wanted to take. I don't think it's out of control.
Yeah,
how do you see
Yeah,
this?
I see there are two kind of a nationalism acts in two ways. One, to the regime, as Andy said, it adds or it enhances legitimacy. It's an old standby. It's a safer old standby that you can always reach back. No matter how fragile other sources of legitimacy will be, that, at least in foreign policy, nationalism is always a good one. That is a good old standby. But it's also that dangerous side that is, is sometimes irrational. It could be, arouses xenophobic, sort of, I would say, imperialistic kind of, emotions that the regime obviously see as some, and it could be turned inward too. And how, obviously in the past 20 years, we see that every sort of a mass event involved in nationalism could threaten to some extent the legitimacy of the government as well. That is to see, they see the government as too weak or mishandled the whole event, or whole foreign policy issue. So that is related to the second source, as a second source that is from the public, or as a source of public opinion. Because I see that in the recent decade, I think Andy probably will agree that, the domestic foreign policy making process now involves more actors than before. This is no longer a kind of iron, a sort of a curtain authoritarian that in Mao era or even Deng era. Now we have more actors: the military, the foreign policy, foreign affairs types, the large overseas investment type of national or state-owned enterprises, and public. So all of them have some say. And interestingly, public now has more way to express their opinion of foreign policy over Japan, over this conflict in South China Sea with the United States. All these major foreign policy issues seem to people become more vocal. Now that, of course, we'll also have the social network, social media, add to that expression of nationalism. So that I think is another source from the public as well that push it, not just the government's on and off as a mechanism.
So does the role of public opinion actually put pressure on the government to pursue a conception of the national interest that is more ambitious, more confrontational, more xenophobic than they would like? Or does China's own power lead the elite to have a more developed sense of the national interest just because more things are imaginable as goals of Chinese policy?
That's a very good question. I don't know if Andy will agree with me. I see it now with China's foreign policy right now, and it's in a stage of a post-Deng foreign policy principle. That Deng, the early 1990s, Deng's principle is, of course, lay low, don't take the lead, protect your interest, but not stick your head out. And that is very much a passive, reactive foreign policy. That seems to, at least that consensus that has changed, began to change. The question is whether it has been something new to replace it. That's my sense is that it has not been a new consensus. What would replace that principle? They know that probably out of date. Now China is #2 economy in the world. It has to take a more active role in the world. It has to protect its overseas national interest, energy, otherwise. But what kind of posture say over issues like sovereignty over in China's coastline. So in that sense, I don't know that there's a consensus. In fact, I see debate is still going on. That includes the nationalistic sort of public opinion, but also the military. All talk about the industrial defense complex or the industrial defense complex in this country. I see that in China too.
Yeah.
There's that interest to push that. I mean, Andy is much more, I think, is more informed in that maybe.
Andy, one of the issues that has grabbed international attention in the past couple of years has been China's interactions with its neighbors over exactly the questions that Xiaobo raises. That is, territorial conflicts over small bits of rock and sometimes larger land formations in seas around China. Can you say what China's strategy is in dealing with these issues and with its neighbors in general? Is it to intimidate them, to divide them, to win them over? So far, I think most people would say the evidence is of a more assertive China that cares less about the opinion of other governments and about the impact on public opinion in other societies. Does that reflect a misperception of what they should do, or is it their choice?
These territorial disputes that China has settled most of its territorial disputes with its neighbors, but these particular ones in the East and South China Sea with Japan around the Senkaku or Diaoyutai Islands and with Vietnam and the Philippines and others in the South China Sea are, I think China's strategy is the following. Is number one, we have just as good of a historical and legal claim to these various islands as the others have. Number two is the value of these territories has just been constantly increasing. The fishery value, the underwater resources value, and the strategic value. All of these values have increased with the increase in the technology to exploit the resources and the military, the rise of navies that can, exert more power across the sea. That these are important interests. These are not just little bits of rock, but they are the territorial seas that go under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea that go with these bits of rock, and they're incredibly important to Chinese security. So the game here is to win in the long run. I mean, this is something worth having. There's certainly no reason to back off from presentable claims just because the other guy has presentable claims and he yelps and makes complaints that you're offending his public opinion when you. So I think that they have moved to a more assertive posture because they evaluate that their power position is more favorable now than it was before. Their navy is bigger. I think they think that the U.S. is a weak power. And it's not only a declining power, the U.S. declining economically and overstretched militarily, but it's structurally weak with this crazy political system that we have and presidents that come and go every 4 years, never get anything done and stuff like that, and lack of support for U.S. power projection overseas. I think they don't believe that the Obama pivot to Asia is going to really amount to anything or really survive if they show strong resistance to it and let the Americans know it's going to be costly, that the Americans will climb off it. And I think they see the Japanese as weak, and they see the Vietnamese and the Philippines as, a joke. So I think they feel that if they maintain pressure, they don't want to get into an armed conflict and settle this thing today.
So they're not doing this because they feel encircled or vulnerable or anxious. They're confident. You're describing a very contentious, sharp-elbowed, assertive China.
I think they feel that the U.S. is in a spasm of containment, that it is in a misguided track to build up alliances with other countries to contain and encircle China, that the U.S. has been in a habit of patrolling the entire Chinese coast with ships and aircraft 12 nautical miles out and saying, this is freedom of navigation. I think the Chinese are like, well, the time has come for freedom of navigation to work in the other direction. Get off my back. So they do feel encircled, but I think they believe that the power balance is shifting and the time has come for them to send a message back.
Steve, I just want to add two other arena. I call it probably two carrots. That's also beyond the sort of the stick that China is obviously is willing to wield, and that is the economic and so-called other soft power.
Yeah.
Economically, that's right. I think China also, in the special last 10 years, also pushing this, ideas of not just trade, but not just foreign aid to countries like Cambodia, investment, but also free trade. They were very actively pushing for ASEAN+3, ASEAN-China free trade, and so on. And because they're a believer in the interconnectedness or the interdependence of economics in the economic arena, what eventually reduces the conflict, tie China closer to Southeast Asia and makes that sort of reduces the danger of conflict. So that I think that China is pushing that, and that they firmly believe that's the sort of the kind of carrot they want to use. Another area that's also I see competing. China realize that they're competing, but also kind of realize they're in a weaker position. That is sort of the soft power. The regime or the system, the culture. This particularly in the country of Myanmar. It's very interesting. Chinese leaders are watching that very closely, and they see that as Myanmar as a, if I will use the term, battleground between the United States and China. It's not just hot power, but soft power.
And do they think they're losing?
They think they're losing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. They think they're losing. They're losing, yes, pretty badly, because most recently last week they reported that even there's some sort of project that was being affected, environmental impact assessment that causes some locals to demonstrate against the Chinese investment. And so Chinese are now feeling clearly to me that Chinese are feeling that they're losing that struggle.
Andy, the class has read an article by Michael Beckley, which says that actually China is not catching up and overtaking the U.S., and that in fact the American position together with its allies remains quite strong. But you've described a different perception on the part of the Chinese, and together those two seem to promise a kind of clash. If Beckley is right about the strength of the American position, which may become more of a consensus over time and certainly fortify this pivot policy of the Obama administration, and the Chinese feel that they are in a commanding and advantageous position that they want to exploit, we're in a new world, aren't we? Aren't we in a new world of potential conflict between China and the United States?
There is that risk, and Beckley, that's part of Beckley's PhD dissertation at Columbia, and I agree with him.
Small commercial announcement here.
And also a commercial announcement, my co-author Andrew Scobell and I published an article in the Washington Quarterly in the last issue called China's Overstretched Military. Not the same as Beckley's argument, but the Chinese military, we think, is overstretched with all the missions that it has to perform. But I think they feel that, the weakness of Japan, and so you're right. I think they know that their military has a lot. So in the specific arena of the East and South China Sea, I don't see the Chinese saying, we're a great power, we're going to invade the Middle East, Africa, Mexico or something like that. But I think they feel that the East and South China Seas are after Taiwan and Tibet and Xinjiang. So the number one thing is to keep control of Xinjiang, Tibet, get a hold of Taiwan. And that's where most of their military preparation goes. But the chances of war over those three territories are small. And then I think the next priority, because it's the next one on the map even, are these East and South China Sea arenas where I think they feel that they have a kind of psychological advantage over the long run. I think their strategy is very long run. However, the possibility of miscalculation is there, and it requires a lot of consultation and diplomacy, and reassurance, perhaps, on all sides that the other party's interests will be respected and all that. So it's a risky scenario.
Risky because, just to get back to the point I made a moment ago, because there may be a kind of differing assessment on the two sides as to what their power position is.
Right. So it's a classic, perception, misperception, security dilemma sort of an issue, Bob Jervis type issue. That doesn't mean it's inevitably going to end in tragedy, though.
Well, we can take up that ponder the question of tragedy after this class. But I guess I'd like you to comment on the problem which came up in a significant way in the discussion that we had about American foreign policy earlier in the week in Conceptual Foundations, where there was a kind of consensus among the faculty on the panel that the United States was going to have to examine its alliance commitments, because most of these issues that we're describing in East Asia and Southeast Asia involve a choice on the part of the United States about how much to back up allies. Do you see that looming as the kind of question that will force a kind of re-examination in
Before
American
Andy
policy?
answers that, let me jump in there.
Yeah, good.
That's exactly what I think the Chinese are looking at, examine very closely. They look at, how they, because they really, when China has, it wants to engage in a conflict with Japan, with Philippines, with Vietnam, they always look at what, it really is not the country directly involved, but the United States. So they look at that, as you said, that the kind of alliance, what kind of commitment. So they follow very closely. Yesterday, was the Senate passed some resolution which even not reported in the United States, but it was on top of the Chinese news that there's certain commitment to Diaoyu or Senkaku. It's part of the security treaty, as a Senate explaining that's part of that treaty commitment. So that China picked it up very quickly. So that from Chinese leaders' point of view, they watch that very closely. So one could argue
they might be more aware of this resolution than any member of the United States Senate.
See, that's exactly right. So, no, that's exactly right. So they're very close. So the argument goes the other way around, that is to deter China's possible involvement in a high degree of conflict, that United States role is pivotal. It's crucial. I mean, that I was leave that, and then I'll leave the.
But I don't think
I'm going to just say one thing. We're going to, after one last comment from Andy, we're going to turn to students for their questions and give them an opportunity to come into this discussion.
So the alliances that come into play with respect to the East and South China Sea are those with Japan and the Philippines, and the informal alignment that we had with Vietnam, and to some extent
our traditional ally, Vietnam.
I was going to say, that's true.
And our alignment with India, and we have a formal alliance with Australia, which probably won't be involved in this particular set of issues. And I think these alliances and alignments are those being proactive. These are not cases of the U.S. being dragged into a war that it doesn't want by an ally that's an adventurist, like at one time was a risk with Taiwan, or which some people believe is a risk with Israel. These cases are the opposite. These are cases of the U.S. fostering these alliances and urging the allies to cooperate more with us, and the Japanese to be more, pay more of our basing costs and commit to greater cooperation with us in developing theater missile defense. We are the one that wants more and more and more, because it is our strategy to do this, to show strength in Asia, not because we have an national interest in strength in Asia for a variety of reasons. The tricky thing comes in trying to reassure the Chinese, and all of our declaratory policy is reassuring. This is not against China. We welcome the rise of a prosperous and stable China and all that. The trouble is they don't believe it.
Well, can I ask you, though, just one last question before we turn to student questions. If the dynamic is as you describe it, the United States pushing toward stiffer policies on the part of regional countries toward China. Why is it that you don't find these countries expressing uneasiness and reluctance in telling the Chinese, listen, the Americans are a little out of control here, but we want good relations? Or do you?
I don't think you do. I think what you have is that these countries have, I mentioned how important these disputed territories are to the Chinese. They are likewise to the other parties. They're very valuable. So I think that and in some cases the Chinese claims, although legally and historically presentable, are a little bit absurd on their face. So claims by China to land features that are very close to the Philippines would appear to be absurd, although they're not actually absurd. But they are hard for the Philippines to just kiss it off and say, oh, you want that? Have it. You know, that doesn't make sense for them either. Mm-hmm. I think everybody has some very real interests at stake.
Yeah, I agree. I think in this, there are three sort of group of actors involved. The regional, smaller actors, ASEAN, China and United States, right? So I completely agree with Andy that the intention of the United States to strengthen the alliance or allies in the region is to deter the ones that evolve. The minor partner, the partner to be involved directly come from China, dragging us into it. So, but the Chinese don't believe I don't believe none of that. They think that you can see that very clearly from the Chinese media, cartoons. The United States is behind it. Mm-hmm. They're not pushing it too closer and dragging them away. There was a cartoon I just saw yesterday. I thought very telling. I think it was Xi Jinping reached out to this new Prime Minister of Japan, whoever it is. Then Obama's dragging him away. So that's how they see this alliance. It's the United States behind hardening of all the minor alliance partners. Now, for the minor ones, they want the United States to be the major one to deter China. So each one of them has all kinds and then the United States, China will see, of course, is the United States coming back to the region to stir up the trouble.
Great. On that note, why don't we see if students have questions that they would like to put to our panel here.
About the Senkaku Islands, I think one could, while they are very, very valuable, one could make the argument that the Chinese are perhaps pushing the issue to show the Japanese the limits of the strength of the alliance, or just testing it, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Do you think that the Chinese, for both panelists, are kind of like systematically underestimating the Japanese could go nuclear in anywhere from 6 months to 2 years if they wanted to, if they did not feel as if the security arrangement with the United States was there. What would be do you think that would actually promote more stability in the region if the Japanese had a nuclear deterrent that was their own and didn't have to rely on the United States? Is that even a possibility? I know it's a very open-ended question. But.
Yeah, that's that's really in line with what Andy just said, that, the purpose of the United States to strengthen allies in the region with Japan, for example, is to, to really not make Japan to be, to really feel they're threatened, they need to do their own thing, so to speak, right, to run amok. So they want to keep Japan in line. That's argument that Jared Curtis has all along been arguing. I think Chinese don't see that way, and that's a tragedy of it. I think that Chinese think that without the United States behind it, they were willing to fight a war with Japan. I think they are. They are willing, and they don't take Japan that, they think they can now. That's why I think that they really think they can fight a war with Japan, and they're willing to do it. But the United States is a different story. Whether they're willing to. But you're right. I think that is the danger of it. That when Japan feels they're kind of left alone, they're being threatened, they could probably do their own thing. The nuclear power is, and there are other also military hardware and so on.
I think the Chinese are most concerned with respect to Japan about a trend they see over the long run of a revival of Japanese militarism and a revival of aggression. And there's a lot of evidence that they can point to in terms of the increase of the Japanese defense budget and various decisions to project Japanese power further, for example, to send Japanese ships assist in the provision, logistical operations in Iraq and in peacekeeping operations and so forth. So the Chinese believe that Japan is on a track of remilitarization that they would like to deter. So in deterring it, they welcome the U.S.-Japan alliance in general as helping to prevent that, but they deplore the use of that alliance by the United States to, as they see it, promote. The alliance prevents Japan from developing nuclear weapons, but at the same time urges Japan to develop various other capabilities and accept increased responsibilities within the scope of the U.S.-Japan alliance. So the Chinese see, it's a complicated alliance, and the Chinese, I think, see a good and a bad side to it. And their ability to signal Japan that militarization is the wrong strategy is quite limited, because the Japanese very much distrust the Chinese. So I think the Chinese have tried to use various pressure, hoping to kind of wake the Japanese up by sending a message. So I think that's their big strategy toward Japan, is to do what little they can do, which is little, to sort of waken up the Japanese to the lack of wisdom in going down the same path they went down before and lost. So it's kind of a hard wicket for China.
Questions here? Yeah.
Just how would you assess the military's role in China's power transitions? Because considering that we see that military plays a major role in a lot of developing countries and in China, a lot of people are saying that it's the military.
Yeah, I don't believe in domestic politics military played that much of an important role. I think China's still very much of a, the gun under the party. That's, always the principle that Communist Party hold dear for, many last century or so. I mean, last, 70 years. So that still remains true. I think military on domestic affairs, they're less significant their voice, but on foreign policy is a somewhat different issue, because again, security policy, strategic forces involves sort of the kind of budget and hardware for military modernization. So I think they have more on the security policies that China has, but not on domestic politics. I don't that part I have no, I don't see any sign of they intervene in domestic politics.
Yeah, so after, I guess, Yang Shang-kun stepped down from the Politburo Standing Committee in 1997, if I remember correctly. Since then, there hasn't been a military officer in the Standing Committee, and there are usually two. In this current Standing Committee, are there two? And I mean, in the Politburo, in the larger Politburo, since then, there's been a tradition of having two officers in the Politburo. And that was an outward sign of the retreat of the sort of separation. So traditionally, sort of military, civilian were one thing in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. But I think they've really become differentiated. And the military somehow has stepped out of the power transition game, perhaps because it didn't want to be part of it, perhaps because it's not in a position to exert that influence. So it's, from all that I've heard about the negotiations around the 18th Party Congress, I haven't heard anything about military officers intervening or expressing any opinion about who should be in what position in the Politburo or the Standing Committee. And civilian control of the military is structured through this thing called the Central Military Commission, and it's puzzling how it works, because the military pretty much runs itself under this Central Military Commission, which is staffed completely by uniformed officers except for two people, the chair and the deputy chair, who are civilians. How those two civilians control the whole system is very hard to figure out, but they seem to do so. It may be partly because the military has a commissar system, a political education system that thinks of itself as loyal to the Communist Party, and partly because the concept of civilian control of the military in China doesn't really extend to matters of strategy, armaments, war fighting. Those areas are the legitimate. So the central leadership will tell the military guys, be prepared to take Taiwan. They don't go down into the budget and say you need this ship and that plane, and you know that's the military people do that themselves, and then they come back and say we're ready or we're not ready for this particular mission. So it's a somewhat different division of the pie of civil military.
And that's not unique in China's case, right?
Uh-huh.
In some authoritarian regimes, that Taiwan, for example, military
Uh-huh.
never was. There's in
Has
some
more-
developing countries that coup d'état always, military always played a major role in politics. But in some countries, I mean, that again
didn't.
is not necessarily unique.
Uh-huh.
More questions from students? Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about relationships with Myanmar and ASEAN in general. The U.S. has moved pretty aggressively towards Myanmar and in normalizing relations. And I've heard, China, they used to describe Myanmar as like their California almost. So what is China's next move in this relationship? Do you see this escalating to conflict eventually between the U.S. and China? And then also in ASEAN in general, as you see kind of a fragmentation of people aligning more towards China or more towards the U.S. and ASEAN.
I just give you one just again one sort of a story about how this this interesting dynamic between sort of domestic kind of different ideological point of view and foreign policy. This issue, in recent months, that as the United States is becoming more and more, aggressive, more assertive into, sort of a venture into the backyard of China, the reaction actually from liberal intellectuals are very interesting. They see this as good. They use the example as look, even Myanmar, and they're trying to pick up also from Vietnam. That's another closer example. I mean, Myanmar, they're closer because they're really a dictator close to North Korea. If they can change, and China take it also as a kind of a protege of some sort, right? I mean, they relied on the military hardware on China. They need a lot of trade and so on. So they see that as you see as if California. But if they can change, if the United States can change that into democracy and a sort of a shining beacon in the backyard, and that would make pressure on Beijing. So that's a liberal sort of intellectuals see how this developed, and they want to pick up sort of rumors or innuendos about how anti-corruption measures in Vietnam played out in that country. The so-called Sunshine Law. They passed Sunshine Law, although I checked, it wasn't true. It wasn't quite sure that was where that come from. But they want to use that. Those countries, as an example, see authoritarian in those countries can change. Don't learn from North Korea. North Korea is their laughing stock. They use it as another example. So that's just in social media, and this is very true. So meaning that reaction to Myanmar, U.S. and Myanmar, is quite interesting. It's no longer kind of everybody see this as a somehow overreach of the United States in the backyard. Some people do. I mean, those nationalists are sort of a more angry youth. They still see that's a part of this encirclement of the United States. They use soft power to change, not necessarily military power. There's one more kind of friends being taken away. See that, but others see that as a differently. So I see that's also giving me hope that even in foreign policy issues, and not all over Japan, for example, not everyone agreed with this. This whole using violence against Japanese in today's interest in China. So you see that, at least that I see that you see different voices now being voiced.
So I think in Myanmar, the Chinese have definitely suffered a setback, but it's not a decisive, permanent setback. The military is still basically in control there. Democracy is far from consolidated. The Chinese economic presence remains by far the largest outside economic presence, and some of their investments have been rejected, like the whatchamacallit dam and another one recently. But a lot of their other economic interests there are still there, and I think they'll be just looking to minimize the loss, keep as much of a presence as possible, and they have no way to intervene or to determine the direction of Myanmar politics, and they seldom use sanctions or polarize relations. I think they would rather wait and see and minimize loss and in the end of the day, Myanmar is going to be there next to China. It's not going to be next to the United States, and I think they see that as a long-term. Now, as far as ASEAN goes, it's quite divided on the question of China. Obviously, some of the states, especially Cambodia, is emerging as a kind of client state of China, and Vietnam is in the forefront of resistance to Chinese influence, and it's hard to get the whole ASEAN together. And I think Xiaobo made a good point that, again, China feels, you know, we're here, we have a huge amount of economic complementarities, and that's going to tell a lot in the long run. So I think they would like to divide, you know, not all the ASEANs have the same interest in these South China Sea disputed areas. It's predominantly the Philippines and Vietnam. Who else? Brunei has a claim, which they haven't been very active in pursuing, and I think Malaysia has a small claim, is that right? And Malaysia hasn't taken the trouble to sort of get in bed with the Vietnamese. I think a lot of them feel if the Vietnamese want to you know, make a crisis out of this, we'd rather not get wrapped up in that particular conflict. So I think the Chinese can, the Singapores promote the idea of a code of conduct and stuff like that. So they're interested in, so, you know, there are many different strategies unfolding under the umbrella of ASEAN, and the Chinese can take advantage of those divisions to try to play the game their way.
Andy and Xiaobo, I want to end by asking you the $64 question.
Future.
The
No
very
inflation.
biggest,
Future. Look
the
into
very
future.
biggest one of all. Which
Santa
is
Claus?
to get back to the question of China's own evolution. What do you see the main alternative paths being for China? And is there any way in which the uncertainty about its future represents a vulnerability that other countries in some way will want to exploit?
So I think the regime's game plan is to have a gradual, step-by-step implementation of things like transparency, like anti-corruption, like what they call intra-party democracy that would re-legitimate the government and make it more acceptable. And they think of Singapore as a model, even though Singapore is very different in a lot of ways. Strengthen the legal system and generally move to a sort of civilized authoritarian, civilized one-party system that can be survivable in a historic time frame. I mean, nothing is forever, but in a really historic time frame. I think that's their game plan, and I think it's definitely a possible outcome. I guess a second outcome is kind of another Tiananmen, kind of some event, foreign policy event, or some outrage that occurs domestically that leads to people just saying, I've just really had it now, and pouring out into the streets and creating a widespread civil disorder, which the regime really tries everything to prevent and head off and to foresee and to make unlikely. It's a possibility, and how that would go, I don't know. That could go to one of the classic scenarios of democratic transition and a real democracy, which would be, in that case, the beginning of a whole new set of problems, as we see in the Arab Spring. That once you have democracy, the sort of, as Philip Roth said at the very end of his novel Portnoy's Complaint, where the psychiatrist finally says to Portnoy, "Well, shall we now begin, Mr. Portnoy?" That would be, you know, Portnoy's Complaint is all about a psychoanalysis that goes on, and it's Portnoy talking about all of his troubles from page 1 to page 450. And then the second character, the psychiatrist, says, "Shall we now begin?" And that's the end of the book,
Right.
Because, all right, you get it.
Yes.
So, so that would be, now, it is true that foreign countries are, I wouldn't say it's a strategic plan to destabilize China, but I think it is true that there are various foreign entities like the National Endowment for Democracy and others that are working all the time to push change in China, to strengthen civil society, which does, you know, increase the problems that the Chinese government has to deal with.
or as a perennial
a little bit on the main alternatives and how you see them.
I mean, as a perennial optimist, I have to say that I see a little bit rosier picture than my esteemed colleague Andy. But that's, again, it's a long term. I think I agree that in short term, maybe China's still going to continue on this model through sort of a quasi, sort of a Singapore, less authoritarian, further authoritarian, that route for a while. But I think, again, I'm a true believer. I think, you know, the classic democratization theory of Lipset holds. When you have economic growth, when you have a changing social structure, you know, middle class and so on, and that, you know, that pushes new demands for change. So that China, what China has done in the last 30 years to really, I think, is dig its own grave for the authoritarian regime. I do believe, and I see that, maybe not in my lifetime, but I do see, I hope there will be, that in the next 30 years that, you know, China will become a democracy. What outcome, I don't know. What it means to the world, I don't know. But I do believe there could be competitive elections. I mean, there are other changes before that even. You know, we talk about transparency, we talk accountability, we're talking about, you know, they're playing, increasing the role of the legislature, and so on and so forth. There'll be maybe more changes, gradual, piece by piece changes before that qualitative change, you know, happen.
And does that qualitative change happen through a crisis or just through the accretion of smaller incremental changes?
I actually don't think that, you know, the kind of bloody, bloody kind of event of revolution would happen. I actually don't think that probably won't be the case. Because by then, when you have a quality, you know, piece by piece, the incentive for that kind of uprising on both sides is lesser. On the side of, you know, you use the heart, you know, usually revolution is caused by the, you know, hardliners of the regime, right? And by the radicals on both sides. I see that could be avoided. It could be, you know, more of a smooth, you know, qualitative change than the crisis. So I'm a little bit more optimistic.
That's nice. I look forward to it.
We could offer our viewers the invitation to come back in 30 years and see whether Professor Liu or Professor Nathan is correct. Fortunately, in Conceptual Foundations, we have the opportunity to interrogate them again a year from now when we will do the same kind of panel discussion, and we can update your forecasts at that time. Thank you very much for joining us, Andy and Xiaobo, and the students here and those of the students who are watching remotely. Thanks.